This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for October 22nd, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, checkers.
We have a great show for you today. I'm going to talk to you about a blob with 720 sexes and no brain.
Oh boy.
And then Adam is going to explore whether NASA told a young Hillary Clinton that women can't be astronauts.
That's right.
But first, Halloween Candy Fear-Mongering 2019 edition. Christina, take it away.
Can you guys believe that Halloween is just over a week away?
Yes, I understand calendars.
Yes. You know what that means, though? It's fear-mongering time. Now, regular listeners may remember a couple of years ago, I covered a jack-o'-lantern full of Halloween myths, including the pervasive Halloween sadism, a term apparently originally used in a 1974 PTA monthly op-ed.
It feels like this has been covered on the podcast a few times, actually.
Maybe.
Actually, to Pat's credit, way back in episode 12, I looked at razor blades and apples.
Wow.
How do you remember it was 12 off the top of your head?
I can search our website. What's the website? TRCpodcast.com.
It's a great website.
Now, PTA as in Parent Teachers Association. It's used to describe the practice of giving out contaminated treats to random children during trick-or-treating with the intention of causing harm. Every year, we're bombarded by news stories warning caregivers to thoroughly check their kids' Halloween candy for fear someone has poisoned the candy or concealed sharp objects like razor blades or needles in them. This has been a thing since I was a kid, and to your point, Darren, we've covered it a few times. Joel Best, a professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware, has investigated reported Halloween sadism incidents back to 1958, and he's updated his paper every year since 1985. Now, in the many years he's studied the data, he hasn't found one substantiated report of a kid being killed or seriously injured by candy while trick-or-treating. Now, as I mentioned the last time I covered this, reported incidents over the years turn out to be hoaxes or just haven't been proven. I cited an older Snopes article about one proven case of Halloween candy poisoning of an 8-year-old boy named Timothy O'Brien. You guys may remember this once I say it because you were all audibly horrified at the time. He sadly died at the hands of his dad, who laced pixie sticks with cyanide. He also gave poisoned pixie sticks to his daughter and 3 other kids who luckily didn't eat them. Now, this was apparently an effort to cover his tracks and make the murder look random.
So this is potentially one example of tainted candy that did get handed out, but we're talking about 3 pieces of candy in like all of U.S. history, right?
It's a proven case of Halloween candy poisoning, but the explanation behind it is not that it was given to random kids, trick-or-treating type thing. Nicknamed the Candyman, the dad was convicted of murder and executed in 1984. Now, Snopes actually did a roundup after Halloween 2017 of reported tampering incidents, but it was published just after my segment aired, so it didn't help me very much. But here's their summary. Nearly all such cases turn out to be nothing. Pranks played by children on their parents, siblings, or friends. False reports generated by attention-seeking children and adults. They involve material that accidentally, rather than deliberately, ends up in a children's goodie bag. Or they're examples of coincidence mistaken for causation. But often, no follow-ups are done on such news stories after the initial unconfirmed reports, leaving the public with the impression that all of them involve genuine cases of tainted candy being distributed to trick-or-treaters.
I mean, if the truth comes out on like November 17th, no one's talking about Halloween anymore in the news. So, I can see how that stuff kind of gets lost, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, their attention's moved on, basically.
Yeah.
And to that point, there's almost never any reports about tainted Christmas cookies, which, granted, it's a different thing, but a lot of people make cookies and sell them in bake sales and give them to other people, and people just buy food at bake sales somewhat randomly, and no one ever's like, and then the Christmas cookies got me.
Yeah.
That's an interesting observation, Darren.
It's an interesting way to poison people.
Mm-hmm.
Don't give Adam any ideas.
But forget poison, needles, and razor blades, checkers. There's a new concern in the day and age of legal cannabis to take heed of. Pot-laced Halloween candy.
Oh, that'd be terrible.
If only you had some stuff to eat if you took it.
It makes you eat the rest of your candy.
Or that's the excuse you'll give your kids when their food is no longer there.
Okay, so here's the headline from ABC News I saw that motivated me to revisit the topic. So I'm going to ask you a question about it, so just listen very carefully. Mm-hmm. Pennsylvania police urge caution against THC-laced Halloween candy. What do you think when you hear that headline?
It sounds like Halloween candy exists that is THC laced, that the Pennsylvania police are saying you should be careful about it. It doesn't necessarily sound like normal candy is being laced with THC, but it is ambiguous linguistically.
Yes, that's what I was trying to get at. Now, what about this headline from a CBS News affiliate? Police issue Halloween warning to parents after finding candy laced with THC.
Well, how are they finding candy if kids haven't trick-or-treated yet?
Any good police force does a sampling of candy ahead of time, Pat.
Right.
Does this mean like there are lollipops with THC in them that exist? Therefore, we're making these alarming.
Yeah,
Well, of
exactly.
course they
What we're
exist.
saying.
Of course they exist. You
Yeah.
can get them at dispensaries.
Sure.
Yeah, well, not here yet.
Soon.
Soon.
You can
yeah.
get them at illegal dispensaries.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now,
You know, that guy Phil in the corner.
okay, so to Darren's point, the first headline is misleading to me. It sounds like they found candy intended to be given out at Halloween laced with THC. Yeah. Now, it's true that police in the city of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, warned parents to inspect any candy they buy to make sure it doesn't contain THC. Quote from their Facebook post, "Drug-laced edibles are packaged like regular candy and may be hard to distinguish from the real candy." Well
Like, what does
done.
that mean? Like, it's packaged in plastic? Like, what does that mean, like regular candy? All right.
Now, side note, recreational weed is still illegal in Pennsylvania, and the company behind Nerds, Ferrara Candy, confirmed the product was counterfeit. There's a great Rolling Stone article from E.J. Dixon linked in the show notes with the title, "Are THC edibles being given out as Halloween candy? What do you think? Calm down, morons."
I'm glad they put that in the headline so you don't like, oh, I read on because I'm
I
afraid.
think that part might have been just a sub-headline, but...
All right.
As
Still
Dixon
lying.
relays, quote, "The warning was apparently inspired by a recent drug bust in the neighboring area of Stony Creek Township, where authorities seized 60 pounds of marijuana and 394 packages of Nerd ropes laced with THC. None of the local media reports covering the bust made any mention of whether or not there was any evidence that the candy was intended for distribution for children, either on Halloween or on any other day." They busted a drug dealer, basically.
Intended for distribution to children. Like, this could totally happen, but someone would have to do it on purpose. Like, there's no chance that this would happen by accident. It would be so much more expensive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think when I first mentioned to you that I was thinking of doing this because of all the THC-laced candy stuff I saw, you made some joke about, because drug dealers are in the habit of just giving away all their stash.
Yeah, I saw a line on Facebook. Don't worry, no one likes your kids enough to give them free drugs.
Yeah.
Now, the same article says reported instances of THC-laced candy do date back to around 2004. There was a chainmail from North Little Rock police, allegedly, that lollipops laced with hallucinogenic drugs were being doled out to teens. Now, Snopes fact-checked that one, and that police department did not ever issue that statement. As Dixon goes on to suggest, Halloween THC spike candy is the new razor blade. Google Trends show searches for Halloween THC candy has spiked every October. Now, that's not to say that some THC edibles couldn't be confused with candy, and we've already touched upon this. We've heard reports of kids accidentally getting their hands on edibles and ending up at the hospital. But there's a distinction between that and some random stranger giving out THC-laced candy to kids for shits and giggles. So I concluded in 2017 that the odds of Halloween sadism are remote, and definitely not in line with what we've heard over the years. Update in the legal pot generation, or cannabis as Darren calls it, not much has changed. This is obviously not an endorsement to stop checking your kids' Halloween candy. You should absolutely check their trick-or-treat bags for anything suspicious. Just don't let the fearmongers spook you.
Or check their stuff for your favorites, so you can take
Yeah.
them.
You can kind of imagine a situation where like someone has some THC-laced candy, and they think that's the bowl to put out. But there's, you buy candy to put out for Halloween in bags of 100.
Wait, really, Adam?
I was getting to a clarification. When you buy candy at the store, it's like in a bag of like 50 or 100, but you're not going to have like a bag of like 100 THC-laced lollipops that you're mistaking for your
if you're a baller, you do.
I guess the flip side of that is, if you're an adult with adult friends who know what they're doing, THC-laced candy could be an interesting thing to have around on Halloween.
Good coverage, Cristina. When I happened to listen to episode 12 recently, very briefly, we mentioned that kids are far more likely to get hit by a car because it's dark. Yeah. They have costumes they can't see as well. There's a lot of kids in the street. So these are the things one should be concerned about if they're concerned about anything, not dangerous things in the candy. And now I'm going to talk to you about a blob with 720 sexes but no brain. But also a story about reporting how information travels and where it comes from. Last week, some headlines went around, through, and around the series of tubes that is the internet. About and these are headlines, the Blob, an organism with no brain but 720 sexes, debuts at Paris Zoo. That's from CBC. Mysterious blob organism with no brain but 720 sexes unveiled at Paris Zoo. This is Fox. Meet the Blob, a creature that has almost 720 sexes but no brain. That's Forbes.
Almost.
Why a brainless yellow blob that can learn is mystifying scientist. BBC. And finally, Paris Zoo unveils the Blob, an organism with no brain but 720 sexes, from Reuters. So mostly they're saying the same thing, although it is odd that Forbes says almost. And that is even more odd because Reuters appears to be the source of all these stories. Fox's piece was short and quoted Reuters twice, but it was really just cut and pasted, although they listed an author of the Fox piece. As Reuters appears to be the source, what did they say? The piece was short and at least partially copied by most, so I'm going to give it in bullet form, but even then, it's hard to avoid near quotation. A Paris Zoo showcased a mysterious new organism on Wednesday, dubbed the Blob, in quotes, a yellowish, unicellular, small living being which looks like a fungus but acts like an animal. No mouth, no stomach, no eyes, yet it can detect food and digest it. The Blob has almost 720 sexes, can move without legs or wings, and heals itself in 2 minutes if cut in half. Bruno David, director of the Paris Museum of Natural History, of which the zoological park is part of, said, quoting Reuters, quoting him, "It surprises us because it has no brain but is able to learn. And if you merge two blobs, the one that has learned will transmit its knowledge to the other." Another quote, "We know for sure it is not a plant, but we don't really if it's an animal or a fungus. It behaves very surprisingly for something that looks like a mushroom. It has the behavior of an animal and it's able to learn." That was reporting by Thierry Chiarello and Catherine Carlson, writing by Benoit van Overstraten, but editing by Nick McPhee. That's how it's listed in Reuters, all those people. 4 people to do all that. It was about 230 words. This is how stories might come together nowadays. But now we see the almost. So Reuters has the content that contradicts their headline. Reuters' story said almost 720 sexes, but their headline said 720, but only Forbes seemed to care that it was almost and put that in their headline. CBC just lists Thomson Reuters as the author of its story, acknowledging that it was not written by their staff, but at the bottom of the CBC piece, there appears to be this paragraph that was not in the Reuters piece. Quote, "In case you're wondering how the Blob has 720 sexes, here's how it works. While human sex cells come in 2 types, sperm and egg, slime molds have sex cells with multiple genes that can come in different combinations. Those combinations determine whether 2 individuals can mate with one another." End quote. Well, who wrote that? Well, it's unknown, because Reuters just had their piece, which doesn't include that line, and CBC did not attribute anything in that article to anyone but Reuters.
Well, it's like they went to do more digging, but they didn't cite where they got that extra little tidbit.
It could be that's how life is. Like, look, we're taking most of the story from Reuters. Fine. Yeah. Just someone write this.
But at trcpodcast.com, you can always find all of the sources that we use for a segment. If we take a little bit off of Wikipedia, there's going to be a Wikipedia link in there.
It's true. It's what we offer to you, the consumer. But Forbes actually wrote something more than Reuters, linking a tweet from the Zoo de Paris as their reference, even though it looks as if they're partially quoting from the same press release. The Forbes piece was written by someone called Girl Scientist, that's GRRL, and in her own descriptor at the bottom of the article, it says, "Although I look like a parrot, I'm an evolutionary ecologist and ornithologist as well as a science writer and journalist." That certainly explains why the piece is more informative and scientifically sophisticated. And these are some excerpts from the Forbes piece. The ability to double its size each day and the ability to attain a size of several kilometers, it's also nearly impossible to kill. Talking about the blob.
Wow.
Several astonishing abilities at the blob and its cousin, the slime molds. And look at that, already something more informative than the other articles. Yeah. So it did talk about unicellular in the main piece that was copied by everyone from Reuters, but the slime molds was not really referenced unless it was later in that CBC piece.
Yeah.
The Forbes piece goes on to say that this blob can solve mazes, mimic human transportation networks, and perhaps their movements are likely hardwired into each cell's biochemistry, because how could it possibly know how to do these things?
Yeah. Cool.
Girl scientist says that at the moment, the blob is classified as Phacerum polycephalum, and its other 900 or so relatives into the kingdom of protozoa, because it shares some traits with those life forms. Huh. Again, look at that science. Yeah. Now, fully quoting from the superb scientific writing in the Forbes piece, the blob is a plasmodium, informally known as a slime mold. The slime molds are a group of microscopic organisms that are superficially similar to bacteria, except they're bigger. Unlike bacteria, they have a distinct nucleus and other cell structures, so they are more similar to plant and animal cells than to bacteria. Plasmodiums are unusual because each individual cell contains many nuclei. Most animal cells have just one nucleus. Yeah. Another quote, although the name plasmodium may be unfamiliar, you have already heard of plasmodiums without even realizing it because malaria are members of this taxonomic group too. Oh. Unlike malaria, and unlike the blob's sci-fi namesake, slime molds do not harm people. Great writing, accessible, and informative.
Yeah.
In times of abundance, the slime molds usually exist as a single cell, but with scarcity, they form a colony, and this goes on to consume other bacteria, molds, and materials. And apparently they like oatmeal.
Wow.
Slime molds can basically only mix their genetic material when they possess a compatible set of mitochondrial genes known as MAT-A, MAT-B, and MAT-C, each of which has as many as 16 variations. She provides a reference. Mm-hmm. So it would appear that slime molds lead very complicated social lives. That's funny. Actually having references in a news piece about science? What a concept. Great. So because she had a reference, I clicked on it, and it is called Maternal Inheritance of Mitochondria, Multipolarity, Multiallelism, and Hierarchical Transmission of Mitochondrial DNA in the True Slime Mold Phacerum polycephalum. And that's by Yosuke Moriyami and Shizuki Kawano in the Journal of Plant Research. Then I looked at the abstract, and this is the latter half of the abstract, quote, although mitochondria are believed to be inherited from the maternal lineage in nearly all eukaryotes, that's multicellular, the mating types of the true slime mold, P. polycephalum, is not restricted to two. There are 3 mating loci, as in like locations, MAT-A, MAT-B, and MAT-C. These loci have 16, 15, and 3 alleles, respectively. Huh. Interestingly, the transmission patterns of MT DNA are determined by the MAT-A locus in a hierarchical fashion. This is the hierarchy. MAT-A7 is greater than MAT-A2, which is greater than MAT-A11, and so on for several more of those. The strain possessing the higher status of MAT-A would be the MT DNA donor in crosses. Furthermore, we have found that some crosses showed biparental inheritance of mitochondria. This review describes the phenomenon of hierarchical transmission of MT DNA in true slime molds and discusses the presumed molecular mechanisms of maternal and biparental inheritance. We're not molecular biologists, but I did notice the numbers 16, 15, and 3, and quickly I'm like, I think that's close to 720. And then it is. Ta-da! That's where the 720 comes from. That someone looked at this and said, well, there are 3 different locations that each have 16, 15, and 3 alleles, and if you multiply all those together, you get 720 combinations, which is where you get 720 sexes. But no article explained that's where it came from.
Of course you need that explanation if you want anyone to.
Well, look at you, Sherlock.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I felt very I felt very vindicated by that, and then slightly undercut when I looked closer, because if you look at the tweet that was referenced in the Zoo de Paris, they have a link to the video of the exhibit and photos of the exhibit, and the photo of the exhibit actually just has a description of all these things. And it says 720 sexes. Okay. Now, it didn't explain where it came from either. Sure. My French isn't that bad. But there you go. So they just wanted to say that you see a somewhat interesting headline. There's a blob, 720 sexes. And the first thing they purposely chose the headline for obvious reasons. Like, how is that possible? What does that even mean? Most of the stories don't actually explain what the 720 sexes are at all. A couple of them did, which was useful, but you have to dig and dig to even find out what it might mean. And then I had to do math to figure it out myself.
And 720 sexes makes a great headline.
Exactly.
It does.
Yeah.
Now finally we turn to Adam, who's going to tell us whether NASA told a young Hillary Clinton that women can't be astronauts.
That's right, Darren. A few days ago, on October 18th, NASA conducted the first all-woman spacewalk. This means that the spacewalk was done by an all-woman team. This had astronauts Cristina and Jessica Meir doing the spacewalk. This wasn't the first time a woman did a spacewalk, as this was first done in 1984 and has been done 42 times. But it was the first time that it was all women doing the spacewalk. So this was a historic event. Hillary Clinton, who, as many might know, was a presidential candidate in 2016 in the US, shared news about this on Twitter, adding her own story. And I quote, "When I was a little girl, I wrote to NASA and told them I dreamed of being an astronaut. They wrote back and said they weren't taking girls. A new generation of little girls watched today's historic spacewalk. May their dreams of reaching the stars have no bounds." Cool story. How did I first hear about it? Well, I saw someone retweeting it and calling her out on it because of the timeline, which supposedly made this impossible. And there were some mean words in there. If you look at the tweet, there's a lot of mean responses. So what's the deal? Many people would say, for example, that Hillary Clinton was born in 1947 and NASA hadn't sent any astronauts into space until 1962, at which point she was 15 years old, so she couldn't have done this as a little girl, as she claims. So, is she lying? Now, a lot of people asked her to produce the letter, which reminds us of those ridiculous requests for Barack Obama's birth certificate. Others made jokes about her losing it, like all of those emails. Now, is it possible that somehow she wanted to be a NASA astronaut before there were NASA astronauts? Actually, yeah, it's actually something like that. Now, this is something which was claimed time and time again, so a lot of the work fact-checking it was actually done a few years ago. The Washington Post looked at this particular question in 2015. That article mentioned 4 specific times she'd made a similar such claim going back to 1992. Now, at different times, she mentioned being 13 or 14, at one point mentioning that this was around 1961. Those dates all add up. Is this a little girl? Well, some might not necessarily use this term, but indeed, this is likely what she meant by these words, and she has mentioned her age before, so it doesn't seem like she was trying to be deceptive. She wasn't trying to get away with anything. She openly discusses the age at which this happened a lot of times when she recalls the story. So what about the date? In 1961, there were no astronauts in space because NASA hadn't sent any till 1965. Well, it's really simple. In May of 1961, John F. Kennedy, JFK, stated the goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth by the end of the decade.
Not because it is easy, but because it is hard.
So, obviously a very popular claim that he'd made. Now, the important part of this story isn't that NASA didn't have astronauts in space until 1965. But it was well known to the public, including a young Hillary Clinton, that they were working on it and that children across the country wanted to be astronauts because of this. So Clinton and NASA could not produce specific evidence of the letter or the response, but a NASA spokesperson stated that there is no reason to doubt the story's authenticity. What she has stated is consistent with NASA's policies around 1961 and 1962. The requirements for being an astronaut in 1962 at the time were being a military test pilot with a degree in engineering. Those military test pilots at the time were men. Now there's been over 50 years since then, and now there is a 50-50 split of men and women astronauts, which is great. At the time, there was such a rush to get to the moon that NASA didn't really have any interest in re-examining the requirements for being an astronaut. So they were kind of set. Didn't want to open that box. The first woman in space was Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova from the Soviet Union, and this was in 1963. It would also have been feasible for someone of Hillary Clinton's age to attempt to be a woman astronaut, though, as she admits to herself, she had some physical limitations, mainly her eyesight, and also just her not being terribly athletic, which kind of changed her mind of that goal eventually. Now, about that letter. Clinton may not have had hers, but there are 2 very similar letters which have been turned up. One was to a Miss Kelly in February of 1962. It states, and I quote, "This is to advise you that we have no existing program concerning women astronauts, nor do we contemplate any such plans." This was a letter from NASA to a girl who expressed interest. Now, some people, of course, doubted the authenticity of this letter, right? This is how it keeps going. Though NASA didn't have a record of it, they said they had no reason to doubt that letter's authenticity either. Another similar letter was uncovered sometime later, this one from March of 1962 to a Linda Halpern. This one states, and I quote again, However, while many women are employed in other capacities in the space program, some of them in extremely important scientific posts, we have no present plans to employ women in space flights because of the degree of scientific and flight training and the physical characteristics which are required. Now, this letter was sent to Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, in 1963. So you can't really dispute that authenticity unless, for some reason, someone was faking this back in the 80s for, I don't know, eventually thinking Hillary Clinton would say something like this. Now, ultimately, this story, though difficult to prove beyond any doubt, it seems very plausible. It fits with NASA's policy, and it's really not far-fetched at all. There doesn't seem to be much of a reasonable reason to disbelieve this, but it's the world of politics, so some people will disbelieve anything certain people say. That's just how it's gonna be. Hillary Clinton almost certainly did write a letter to NASA telling them that she dreamed of being an astronaut, and got a response telling her essentially that they weren't looking at having any women astronauts. Since then, women have made great accomplishments as astronauts, currently making up half of US astronauts, which is fantastic. Now, one other thing I wanted to touch on is that although NASA sent a number of men to the moon, it's often not phrased as them having flown to the moon or gone to the moon, but having been sent to the moon. This was a massive effort involving a lot of hard-working men and women, the specific contributions by some of those women which are becoming more and more well-known in recent years, and this is great. And it's also good to see that there are a lot more women working at all levels, scientific and as astronauts in NASA, doing a lot of this great work.
Awesome.
Very awesome. And to your other point, the movie Hidden Figures was excellent. Thanks, Adam, and thanks for joining us once again, listeners. Cristina covered possible Halloween candy dangers, and as usual, there aren't really any to worry about, and keep your drugs to yourself. I talked to you about a blob with 720 sexes, which is an interesting organism that science has trouble fully classifying at the moment because it's so unique and diverse. And Adam explored how sexism existed decades ago, and it still does now to some extent.
Sure.
Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Q-Blobs.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
But we don't really if it's an animal or a fungus.
Well, I don't know. I can ask her, but she's in space.
Well, okay, just a second. Is this